Hey everyone, my name is Parsa, and this is my final presentation for Anthropology 320. Introduction. Egypt, one of the most well-known countries in the world. Why do we know so much about Egypt? Well, for one, Egypt has been mainstreamed through movies, TV shows, video games, books, and much more. Many people don't come from Egypt, yet they know so much about their culture, whether it be the pyramids, their gods, or their burial practices. Truth be told, however, much of what you know about Egypt is probably about ancient Egypt. Not many people really know what happened in prehistoric Egypt. Events that transpired in prehistoric Egypt is what led to the culture that we know about today. It is here, in prehistoric Egypt, where the Egyptians developed their ideas about burial practices, religion, and architecture. In this video, I'll be focusing on the pre-dynastic and early dynastic period of Egypt. To give you reference, these dates are between 10,000 BC and 2,800 BC. It is during this time that cities boomed, burial customs were developed, and where the constructions of the pyramids became a reality. Upper and Lower Egypt. Around 10,500 BC, Egypt was separated into two different kingdoms. These two kingdoms were referred to as Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt was towards the south, while Lower Egypt was towards the north. So we have to wonder, why is Lower Egypt above Upper Egypt? Well, it has to do all with the Nile River. In this picture, you can see that the Nile River starts at the conjunction of the Blue River and the White Nile. As you move further north, the Nile River dips into the Mediterranean Sea. This means that the flow of water in the Nile River goes from the south and into the north, where it ultimately links in the Mediterranean Sea. If you take a look at this picture, you can see Lower Egypt at the top and Upper Egypt at the bottom. The reasoning behind Lower Egypt being called Lower Egypt is that at this point, the Nile River is at a downstream going into the Mediterranean Sea. For Upper Egypt, the flow of water is at an upstream. Therefore, upstream correlates to Upper Egypt and downstream correlates to Lower Egypt. So why exactly is the Nile River so important to Egypt? Ultimately, the Nile River is what led to the boom of Egypt. The Nile River drastically increased the allocation of resources available to Egypt. The most absolute fundamental thing that the Nile River provided both Upper and Lower Egypt is fertile land. Along the coast of the Nile River, the richness of the land allowed for the growing of crops. These crops included wheat, flax, and papyrus. Wheat was so very important for the Egyptians as they used wheat as their primary source of food. With wheat, they were able to make bread, rice, and much more. Not only that, since they had so much of it, they were able to sell it throughout the Middle East. Since they sold so much wheat, the economy became very rich. However, that's not to say that flax and papyrus were not important. They were very important. They were important because they used these two to make clothing, baskets, rope, paper, footwear, and much more. The river, Nile River, also provided Egyptians with building materials. The mud that lied at the bottom of the river, when dried in the sun, became a sturdy brick. This is what they used to build their buildings. And lastly, transportation. Due to the richness of the Nile River, the majority of the cities were built along the river. Because of this, boats would be able to sail in either direction and go to whichever city they desired. This then further led to more trade, which then increased the resources being spread throughout Upper and Lower Egypt. burial customs. During the pre-dynastic period of Egypt, bodies were buried in simple little pits. During this time, human mummification had not yet begun. Rather, the dead were buried underneath the ground with an item. Usually, the men were buried with weapons, whereas women were buried with cosmetic items. Also, wealthier people were buried with rich items, such as jewelry or painted pottery. Also, the bodies were usually buried in a crouched or fetal position, facing towards the east or west. The reasoning behind this is that the Egyptians viewed the east and west as the land of the dead. Basically, this means that they wanted the souls of their dead to go to the land of the dead, where they can be at peace. This burial custom became prominent around 4400 BC. To put this date into perspective, the Egyptians first began practicing mummification around 2600 BC. Religion. During prehistoric Egypt and before the Egyptians settled along the Nile River, the idea of religion was not commonplace. There was no shared one religion. As a matter of fact, the concept of God didn't exist. Rather, there were magical powers in place that allowed for life to exist. Before the idea of deities became common, Egyptians viewed rods and staffs as a symbol of divine power. As Egyptians began settling along the Nile River, this is when the concept of deities began. One thing, however, that many Egyptians believed was that there was an afterlife. Unfortunately, during the pre-dynastic period, written records are extremely sparse. It was more so during the ancient Egyptian times where written records emerged. However, their burial customs definitely suggest that religion dictated how Egyptians lived most of their lives. Conclusion. In the year 3150 BC, Narmer became the first king to unify Upper and Lower Egypt. It was during this time that written records were created. With the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, practices between the two became shared. Through the sharing of ideas in regards to religion, Egyptians began to evolve into what became one of the greatest civilizations of all time. The first pyramid finished construction in 2680 BC. The pyramids would house the dead bodies of kings, their families, and their slaves. It was also during this time that the Egyptians developed a shared ideology on deities. These deities were gods and goddesses that allowed for life to exist. Throughout the pre-dynastic period of Egypt, theology developed, agriculture exploded, architecture was perfected, and trade boomed. The unification of Egypt allowed for this civilization to prosper, allowing the culture to become so fascinating to us. Yeet. Thank you for listening to my presentation. My name is Shamsabadi, and this was my final project.